Hey, real quickly, we've got the Bible Thinks Workshop at Hope College in Holland, Michigan on April 25th. That's a Friday evening, and we're going all the way through Saturday, April 26th during the day, working on Genesis 1 through 11 and what it has to say for us today. So we're going to slow jam through that scripture. You can register at hebraicthought.org. Go to the events page and register under the 2025 event in Holland, Michigan. Hope to see you all there. Hi, Dr. Drew Johnson here from Wycliffe Hall Chapel at the University of Oxford, where my other office is at. This week, we are going to play you something a little different. We're going to play you the very first episode of another podcast called Jesus and the Jewish Law. Now, this podcast is a limited run. They're just covering this topic of Jesus's use of the biblical law, what the biblical law is, what it's like. The first episode, they're going to cover 7 misconceptions of biblical law. They did a fantastic job. It's Drs. Paul Sloan and Dr. Logan Williams. I can't ask for anything better. If you want to understand what the biblical law is, what it does, and how it functioned in the life of Jesus, this is your podcast. I think when you hear this, you're going to be very intrigued and want to hear more. So without further ado, like, subscribe, and listen.
Welcome to the Jesus and Jewish Law podcast, a podcast about the Mosaic Law and how Jesus interprets it in the Gospels. We are your hosts.
I'm Paul Sloan.
And I'm Logan Williams.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about some common misconceptions about the law and why it's important to debunk them.
This episode is a bit of ground clearing, getting rid of some misconceptions that really hinder discussion of the details of the law or its role in the teachings of Jesus and his controversies with other groups, especially with the Pharisees. So we're going to talk through 7 misconceptions. Let's jump in.
Right. So misconception 1 is that obeying the law is about earning your way to God. This misconception assumes that God gives the law and then places life with God or salvation as a prize for those who can earn it by their law keeping, often depicted as a scrupulous striving to prove one's worth to God. But this simply isn't the way the law functioned in the Hebrew Bible or much of late Second Temple Judaism. In the Hebrew Bible, God rescues his people from captivity to Egypt and then gives them the law by which they express their allegiance to this God who's rescued them. Or similarly, it's God's own goal to reside with his people. And so to do that, he gives them instructions for the construction of the tabernacle. And then he gives them the laws by which they can approach him safely, maintain the purity of the sacred space, and can live with piety and justice toward God and each other. Law-keeping in that context maintains the covenant relationship, but significantly, this law-keeping is neither presented as some sort of burden nor as requiring sinless perfection for such covenant maintenance, which actually leads to the next misconception that the law is an impossible burden.
All right, misconception number 2, the law is an impossible burden. This is the notion that the law expects perfect obedience, and that as such, it is an impossible standard to live up to. This misconception, I think, comes from a particular construal of some verses in Paul's letters, such as through the law comes the knowledge of sin, and the law came to increase the trespass in Romans. So usually this misconception is embedded within a particular theological framework, which goes a little something like this. God initially gives the law to articulate his perfect standard by which everyone must live. But he only does this in order to make people realize that they actually can't live up to this perfect standard, and this forces them to recognize their need for grace through the crucifixion of Jesus, or something like that. There are many problems with this, but let's name just a few. First, this framework sounds suspiciously like Martin Luther's process of conversion projected onto the history of salvation. Second, I do wonder what this framework entails about our notion of God. So God is giving his people the law and tells them to obey it, but He doesn't tell them that actually it's impossible to obey no matter what. So all of this is just a trick to lure his people into attempt at perfect obedience, which will ultimately fail. This kind of portrays God as like the ultimate gaslighter. Third, and most importantly, I think, the law doesn't portray itself as a burden that's impossible to fulfill. And what illustrates this most clearly is that there are structures built into the law which are able to deal with the problem of certain transgressions, namely sin offerings and the Day of Atonement. The law not only has a list of rules, but it also has prescriptions for how to remedy things when you don't obey those rules. Now, to be clear, there are certain kinds of sins that sacrifices cannot atone for, and we'll get into some of those in the later episodes. But the point here is that the prescription of sin offerings, for example, means that the law doesn't portray itself as demanding absolute perfection.
Right. And that's really significant to get both for your understanding of the Hebrew Bible and, of course, New Testament text. So on to misconception 3. Logan?
Yep. Misconception 3 is that being impure means you are evil or sinful. As many of you will know, in the law, there are a number of statements, most of them in Leviticus, that certain people become unclean under certain conditions. Woman, after she's given birth to a child, is unclean. Men are unclean after having any kind of emission of semen. Lepers are unclean. Dead bodies are unclean. Menstruating women are unclean, so on and so forth. I think many Christian readers have a tendency to think that these things are indications that God is punishing these people by declaring them unclean, or that maybe somehow having the status of impurity means that you are sinful or hated by God. A further misconception that is often coupled with this is the notion that contracting impurity from someone else or from some other source is sinful. These ideas end up leading to certain construals of the Gospels. For example, if you hold to this misconception that impurity is sinful to acquire, then you will think that when Jesus touches a leper, a menstruating woman, or a dead body, he must be breaking the law out of compassion or love or inclusion. And this then reinforces a narrative framework in which the law is mean and strict and exclusionary, but Jesus is loving and compassionate, and so disregards those silly, mean laws. A key problem with this is simply that the law does not portray contracting impurity as something that is sinful in itself. It is something that's a normal part of life. Most people probably would be impure most of the time. The law does say that certain people are not allowed to contract certain kinds of impurity. For example, priests not allowed to contract certain kinds of corpse impurity. And the law also requires you to deal with certain impurities in a timely manner. But the fact of acquiring impurity in itself is not a sin. And moreover, the Torah never entails or implies that people who have contracted impurity are necessarily sinful or being punished for it or anything like that.
Great. All right, on to misconception 4. Misconception 4 is that the law excludes Gentiles. The mistake here is subtle, but I think it's significant. Some of the laws do distinguish Israel as a holy people, but this is not the same thing as excluding Gentiles. On the distinguishing effect of the law, we could mention Leviticus 20, verses 25 and 26, which says, "You are therefore to make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean, and between the unclean bird and the clean. And you shall not make yourselves detestable by animal or by bird or by anything that creeps on the ground, which I have separated for you as unclean. Thus you are to be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy. And I have set you apart from the peoples to be mine." But Israel being distinct from the nations does not mean that the nations are excluded from a life with Israel or even Israel's God. So, for example, Gentiles could live in the land and they came under what we might call civil protections of the law. They could resort to the refuge cities for unintentional killing. They were guaranteed a fair, quote, righteous trial in the legal justice system. They could benefit from the poor tithe. They could join in the feasting at the festivals of weeks and booths. Similarly, they could receive atonement for sin. This is assumed in that they were commanded, like the Israelites, to give a sin offering when they violate a prohibition that obligates them. The law records lots of other benefits, but you get the point. The error often made here, though, is to collapse distinction and exclusion. So the law does distinguish Israel, but exclusion and distinction aren't the same. This error is probably most relevant, or at least most pronounced, in the New Testament, when, for example, Gentiles begin to join the covenant relationship en masse. And some argue that because the law excluded Gentiles, and the Gentiles' inclusion means that the law, which allegedly excluded them, is now obsolete. But this isn't actually what we see, because exclusion and distinction aren't the same thing. So once Gentiles are included, this doesn't mean that distinction goes away. There are lots of New Testament scholars who have argued for this sort of thing. They might say something like, the law is good and it's given to distinguish Israel, but now that it's the time of the nations to come in, the law that distinguished Israel is redundant. However, Gentiles can join the covenant and remain Gentiles in the process. Similarly, that means that Gentiles can join and Israel remains distinct. Thus, I think the law's distinguishing function theoretically can and actually does still obtain in many New Testament texts. Acts certainly, and probably Paul's letters as well. And in this construal, Jews keep laws that obligate them as Jews, and Gentiles keep laws that obligate them as Gentiles.
Now, that was a lot, but we will probably get into these things in later episodes. This point is tied up with our next one, which Paul is also going to tell us, Misconception 5, which is that the law uniformly obligates all humans.
This misconception assumes that the law God gave to Israel applies to all humans equally, irrespective of ethnicity or covenantal status. I think the idea motivating this misconception is either the supposition that the law is some sort of timeless ethical code, and as such, it would presumably be incumbent upon everyone, or that just distinction in and of itself, creating separateness, is something intrinsically immoral or undesirable, which people don't want to ascribe to God or to the law. But whatever the reason, I think this is wrong. The law does differently obligate humans based on various factors. One of those factors is their office, like whether a person is a priest or not a priest. And another factor is their ethnic or covenantal status, i.e. whether they're an Israelite or not. So, for example, in terms of like different legal obligations or practices, the high priest has different obligations than regular priests. The high priest cannot contract corpse impurity, even for his own parents, while the priests can. And priests are not supposed to contract corpse impurity from anyone except close relatives. And priests are required to officiate at the altars. They sprinkle the blood and do lots of other things. But Israelite non-priests are prohibited from doing those things. Thus, it's actually not even accurate to say that the law obligates uniformly among Israel, as even non-priests have obligations that differ from the priests. Relatedly, and this will actually be especially relevant in some New Testament texts, the law does not uniformly obligate non-Israelites. So non-Israelites who reside in the land of Israel aren't obligated to everything that Israel is. For example, the dietary laws, referring in this case to Israel's menu of prohibited animals like pork or camel or whatever else, they're explicitly named as obligating Israel only. So Leviticus 11:2 says, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, these are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth." And then it prohibits certain animals for you, i.e. for Israel. Such animals are unclean to you, that is, to Israel. This is actually all the more evident in an example from Deuteronomy 14:21, which permits for foreigners in the land something that it actually prohibits for Israel. That verse says, "You shall not eat anything which dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who is in your town so that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you, Israel, are a holy people to the Lord your God." Lots of other examples we might go through, but the basic point is that the law doesn't uniformly obligate all humans. And that will be relevant, I think, as we get to texts like Acts 15 and other texts, possibly in Paul.
Right. Super important to get these distinctions right.
Yeah. All right. What's next? I think we're on to Misconception 6.
Indeed. Misconception 6 is that the law only governs external actions. So this is the idea that the law only tells you what to do in your behavior or in your actions, but the law doesn't tell you to cultivate your dispositions or your thoughts or your intentions or your inner spirituality. I think this comes from a certain reading of Matthew 5. In the section known as the antitheses, when Jesus says, "You have heard it said, and I say," two sayings of Jesus are relevant here. In one, he says, "You have heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say, you've already committed adultery in your heart if you look at a woman lustfully." And then second, he says, "You You have heard it said, you shall not murder, but I say everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to the Sanhedrin. One may get the impression that this text shows that whereas the law prohibits certain actions, adultery or murder, Jesus is saying something that the law doesn't say, namely that you need to avoid these internal dispositions. Thus, from this, people derive the contrast wherein Jesus cares about internal dispositions or the internal state of the heart, whereas the law or maybe Judaism cares about doing the right things, just going through the motions, regardless of one's disposition or intention. The main thing to say in response to this is that it just simply isn't true. Right there in the Ten Commandments, God commands Israel that they must not covet a number of things, including your neighbor's wife. This, straightforwardly, is a commandment to avoid certain internal dispositions, one of which would presumably include indulging in sexual thoughts about someone else's wife. Similarly, in Leviticus 19:17, the verse right before the famous "you will love your neighbor as yourself," the law says, "You will not hate your brother in your heart." Both of these things, Leviticus 19:17 and the 10th commandment, straightforwardly indicate that the law obligates people to have or not have certain kinds of internal dispositions, states of heart, intentions. So as we will develop in future episodes, we see in these two statements in the law that Jesus is actually elucidating commandments about internal dispositions that are already present in the law. He's not saying the law only talks about actions, but I want the heart. No, the law wants the heart as well. It does command people who are obligated by it to cultivate certain states of mind, states of heart, and avoid others.
That's right. And it's so funny to me because this one's like famously one of just the fundamental commandments, right? With like, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, obviously. And it's right there, and it's so basic to the
Indeed
desire of God himself for his people that they cultivate, as you said, cultivate these dispositions for proper worship and obedience. Okay, on to misconception 7, and it's about sacrifice. So misconception 7 is that sacrifice is about God punishing an animal instead of you when you sin. Lots of errors are tied up in this one. So a few things we could say. First, I think the most basic error is that such assumptions about sacrifice tend to reduce sacrifice to a means of forgiveness when sacrifice actually has many purposes. One of the most basic features of sacrifice, or one of the most basic goals of sacrifice, is communion with God. So God resides in the tabernacle. These sacrifices create a pleasing aroma to God. Israelites present offerings to say thanks, to keep promises made in vows, to commemorate the liberation from Egypt, to complete a purification procedure so that they can continue to have both communion with God and each other, and lots of other things. And of course, there are offerings for forgiveness. But even when the issue is for forgiveness of sin, it's not the case that God is sort of punishing the animal instead of you, as if you sin and so God wants to kill you, but he decides to kill an animal instead of you. Rather, as Milgram and others have argued, a major component of the offering for sin is the cleansing of the defilement of the sacred space that occurred through the commission of that sin. The idea is that some sins defile the sacred space, and blood from the offering functions to purify that sacred space of that defilement. The sinner is also forgiven if it's an offering for sin, and the space is cleansed. Also, it's important to recognize the limits of the sacrificial system. We'll get into this in future episodes, so we won't do too much here. And there's lots of debate about this, but the sacrificial system does not seem to atone for all categories of transgression. Unintentional transgressions have an offering, and some intentional sins have an offering, but there's no offering that can be made for defiant, or sometimes translated to high-handed sin. There's no stated sacrifice for idolatry or certain sexual transgressions. And murder is explicitly singled out as not being expiable by sacrifice. Also, sacrifices offered in the temple have the effect of purifying that sacred space. But some sins, like murder, defile the land. And there's no sacrifice for land defilement. Leviticus just states, if such defilements accumulate in the land, then the people will be exiled. That's in Leviticus 18:25 and following, if you'd like to read that.
And this point will also be really important when we think more about what Jesus might have thought about the temple.
Right, super important. Okay, I think we got through them all.
Yeah, we did. So those are our 7 misconceptions on the law. We haven't really spent a lot of time offering alternative perspectives or really thoroughly debunking some of these ideas, but we will return to each one of them in future episodes as we dig into more detailed studies on particular topics and particular texts.
Right. And as you said earlier, this is kind of our last ground clearing or throat clearing episode before getting into discrete issues. So what's next?
So in our next episode, we're going to be looking closely at a few chapters in Leviticus and one chapter in Numbers. And we'll give you an overview of the laws pertaining to ritual purity and impurity. That will form the basis for a number of subsequent episodes where we begin to talk about Jesus and purity and impurity and cleansing and defilement in the Gospels.
Great. As always, it's helpful to us if you subscribe, and if you like what you hear in the coming episodes, to give us a rating. That really helps. Thanks, everyone.
Until next time.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.